Welcome to #Lawyers DWI Guide 2020. Today we've got Gregg Gallion and Sean Darvishi breaking down a DWI traffic stop and telling you what you need to know if you're stopped on suspicion of DWI. Welcome back to #Lawyered. Got my co-host Andrea and I, and we're extremely lucky today. We've got defense lawyers Gregg Gallion and Sean Darvishi that are appearing with us via Skype and going to walk through some of this with us. So guys, thank you guys for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So just to tell you guys a little bit about Gregg Gallion, he is the founder of the Gallion firm here in Dallas, Texas. He's a former prosecutor for Dallas County, and he's got a huge breadth of experience in both federal and state criminal defense cases. And one of my favorite things, and you know, I've been bragging about this guy for a while about this. A couple weeks ago, he argued before the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, and just to put it in perspective, it's the highest criminal court in our state. He did a fantastic job, and it basically is the equivalent in a federal case of arguing at the U.S. Supreme Court. And so really glad to have him here. He's a good friend of mine and a real good lawyer. Sean Darvishi, he's out of Houston. He's a Houston, primarily DWI defense lawyer. He actually went to Texas Tech undergrad with me, so I've known Sean for a long time. In 2017, he was noted to have the most not guilty verdicts in Harris County. And he's got a huge commitment, and this is one of the biggest things he brings to the table for us today, is he's got a huge commitment to learning the science behind the prosecution of DWIs, and he spends numerous times a year educating and re-educating himself on this science so that he's in the best position possible to go in and fight for his clients, you know, even after the arrest is over, and dealing with the blood and the breath and all the things that go into it. And so we've got you guys here today. You know, I've talked to y'all that we've got a simulated DWI traffic stop that we're going to run through, that we actually are probably going to have a little fun with. Little note for our audience: my little brother is the driver, and he definitely was the comedian in the family. So.
And I haven't seen these videos, y'all. So I've been promised some laughs.
We're going to get the real authentic laughter of Andrea today when she watches the video. And so kind of just to jump right in, I want to give a little overview, and then I want to let our guys get in and start talking about this stuff. So in a DWI stop, Andrea, like you and I were talking about, you've got three phases really, and a cop, what he's trying to do, or she, is to determine whether or not you're intoxicated and been operating a vehicle. And they're looking at three different phases: the traffic stop, the first approach, when they actually meet the driver at usually the window of the car.
So when they're waltzing up to that car window.
Right, and you see the body cam shaking back and forth and the suspense and everything. And then what we call the SFSTs, and they're the field sobriety tests.
Gotcha.
And that's the part where you get to see, in my experience, some of the comedic moments of being a DWI defense lawyer. You get to see some interesting dance moves or some falls and some things like that. And so kind of jumping right into the traffic stop, the reason that the officer stopped in your vehicle. Sean, I kind of want you to let our audience know, at this point, when the officers are trailing a vehicle, what are they typically looking for whenever it comes to trying to stop somebody on suspicion of a DWI?
Sure. Well, they're really looking for anything and everything. We see all the time offense reports where officers are pulling people over for having one of their lights burn out near their license plate. That's probably one of the most common ones. And then they're going to be seeing to see if you're swaying back and forth. It's not itself a traffic stop to just swerve back and forth. There has to be something dangerous that is added to that. But officers will do anything and everything to find an excuse to just pull you over, especially if it's that time of night.
So, one question I get a lot, and I'd like to hear your commentary on this, is that people say, well, I wasn't actually violating a traffic law and he pulled me over. Does that mean it was a good stop? Is that an illegal stop? What does that mean?
Sure. So, obviously perception is always a little bit different, and sometimes they're absolutely right and sometimes they're absolutely wrong. The important thing is when somebody gets pulled over is you don't want to admit to that, right? You don't want to say, yeah, officer, I was speeding. It's, officer, I don't know why you pulled me over. Can you tell me? Make him articulate it. Because when he says that out loud, I get to then use that down the road in trial. And if he changes his mind, writes something different on the search warrant, if there's a blood case, then we get to use that against him.
So, Sean, I'm glad you said that because that actually transitions perfectly. I want to look at our first clip of the mock stop, and Sean and Greg, I want to hear both y'all's commentary on what this driver did right or wrong whenever he was asked why he thought he was being pulled over.
All right, sir, do you know why I stopped you tonight?
Well, it could have been I was speeding, I took an illegal left turn, I ran through a stop sign, ran through a stop light. Might have clipped somebody in the school zone the whole time I was texting, I was checking Facebook status. I did tweet a little bit and report somebody on Instagram, but I don't know. Could it be one of those?
So we got our first Andrea laugh of the show. That's perfect. That's perfect. So, Greg, I'll start with you, man. Tell me what you think about that driver's reaction to to being pulled over and asked that question.
Well, it couldn't have been worse for his defense at some point.
Bottom of the barrel response.
Yeah,
Wow.
not even. He didn't have the officer articulate the reason for why he was actually initiating the stop, but instead just had some sort of guilty conscience and confessed to upwards of 10 violations. Funny, but hopefully not what people take away from this podcast.
So no stream of consciousness word vomiting when you're pulled over by a cop.
I say talk as the least amount as possible. People, when they're in high stress situations, tend to just go and go and go, and officers know that, and they're going to use it to their advantage, especially the officers who have been doing this for a while. So the more that you just be quiet and only answer the questions that you're being asked, I think the better off you'll be. You're not going to be able to explain your way out of it most
I
of
have
the
a question.
time.
I'm a woman.
Of course.
If I cry, will I get out of this situation? Like, not ugly cry, like cute cry.
That may be the situation for a speeding ticket or something that you're pulled over for truly an innocent reason. But I believe that if an officer, when they're out that late at night trying to arrest somebody for DWI, if they think you're intoxicated, gone are the days where they're going to let you go because you're crying.
I'll stick with Uber then.
So, Sean, I want to hear your opinion. What do you think about the fact that he was tweeting, Facebooking, and Instagramming at the same time?
That's kind of impressive.
It's not great to do that. If you ever get pulled over and an officer asks you about being on your phone or something like that, make sure you pull up the Google Maps app as you're getting pulled over.
There you go.
Ooh.
It's an exception to the rule. And if you're checking your maps, then they have nothing. And they have to actually know kind of what you were doing before they pull you over. Something the driver did here is he could have done something to make it a lot easier for himself. If he would have already had his license and insurance pulled out right from the bat and had it ready to go, those are things that I know. So whenever I'm going through a DWI trial, I look at intoxication. What's normal, what's not normal. It's really normal to have your license and insurance ready to go. Drunk people are going to forget that, and they're going to try to get their way out of it, talk their way out of it, and it's never going to happen, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, and that's a great piece of advice. I mean, I've seen many times where the fumbling of trying to find the license and registration, I mean, that's one of the things that you all of a sudden you start to see signs of intoxication at that point from the officer's perspective. So the traffic stop part, that's the first phase of the investigation. That's part of where the officer's trying to find evidence of this guy or this girl looks drunk and they're operating a vehicle. Second part is what a lot of us call the first approach, or at least I use that term, and that's when the officer first comes to the window and makes contact or starts talking to the driver that's sitting there. Greg, can you kind of fill us in? What signs in that situation are the officers looking for to give them evidence that the person is actually drunk?
Yeah, so this first approach, contact phase, is what the officer is trying to use to gather some more information to prolong his investigation. Because up until this point, the only legal justification that he or she has in pulling you over was the reason that they pulled you over. Now, we all know that when an officer pulls somebody over at 2 o'clock in the morning, we know they're looking for someone who's been drinking and driving. That's really their only agenda.
Right.
And so during this contact phase, what they're looking for is they're looking at everything with a fine-tooth comb. You could see the same driving behavior at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and it wouldn't get any sort of attention from an officer. But the fact that it's 2 a.m., as soon as that officer makes the traffic stop, they're going to the car and they're going to critique every single thing you do, how quick or how long it takes you to respond to an answer, what you're doing in the car, how you sound when you're talking. But the most common signs that officers are looking for is whether or not you smell like alcohol, whether you have bloodshot, glassy eyes, and whether you have slurred speech. Those are common indications that officers use in their DWI investigations.
Now, Sean, I know that many people who deal with DWI, they've dealt with this situation before. What are some of the strategies you try to use when you're combating the officer saying in his report that he had slurred speech, he had bloodshot eyes, I smelled alcohol? Because, the smelling of the alcohol is something that we literally can't, there's no other evidence other than what the officer says, right? So, what's kind of the stuff you're looking for to defend that situation?
Sure. So obviously, when comparing your client when they're sober versus what they are when they look on video, that's big. In trial, we can do something called a voice exemplar, where they're able to read a document out loud, Star Spangled Banner, something like that, without giving up their Fifth Amendment rights to not testify. So we use that to kind of compare language there. Something that's kind of important to note, and I think if you are somebody getting pulled over, you should know this too, is you're going to smell like alcohol, even if you have one drink or if you have 10 drinks. The smell of alcohol does not change. I could have drank a whole handle of whiskey and I'd smell the same as somebody would have just had one or two shots. And by saying that, if the officer goes, hey, well, you smell like alcohol, step out of the car. If you're a citizen and you say, well, yeah, I had a drink, so of course I smell like that, officer. Why is that a problem? When you start to voice your concerns when you're being stopped, that helps. Without being that person who goes, I know my rights, I'm going to do everything, this is crap, that's never going to fly well. But if you are just calmly and intelligently voicing your concerns and how everything's going, it's going to make my job a lot easier down the road.
So just keep calm and carry on in that situation.
Absolutely.
Well, and I think one thing, and we're going to, actually, I'll just let the clip speak for itself. So we're going to go ahead and move into our next clip, and this is a simulation of a first approach and how I want to hear y'all's opinion again on what the driver did right and wrong in this situation.
We got car 6-4, traffic stop, suspicion of DWI, over. Hey, how we doing tonight?
All right.
Good. You know why I pulled you over?
I don't know, sir. What can I do for you?
Okay, well, let's start with the license and registration first.
All right. Can you hold that for a second?
Well, sir.
Yeah.
I'm gonna need you to step out of the car.
Why?
All right, so Greg, I'm gonna let you take the first stab at this. What's your opinion of how he handled that situation?
Man, cool as a cucumber for someone who's holding a beer when the officer approaches. Clearly not an ideal situation. I think whenever you have any sort of alcohol-related substance in your car, it's only a matter of time before you're out of the car being eventually arrested for DWI. But there is an enhancement in the Texas Penal Code for an open container.
And
so
I'm
anytime that
actually
you're
going to-
operating a vehicle with a container that's open, so not like an unopened beer or an unopened bottle of wine, but something that's been opened, it's an enhancement in the Texas Penal Code, and it's automatically going to get you out of the car. I mean, there's just no other explanation than that.
Do you want to explain what an enhancement is for those of us who do? Well, I know what it is, but I think anyone who's not a lawyer probably doesn't know what it is because they wouldn't really have any reason to know. So what is an enhancement?
Enhancements are, I can use something that's a little bit easier to explain, an assault versus an aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. So an assault would just be some sort of injury causing bodily injury, or an assault causing some sort of bodily injury. The enhancement would be the use of a weapon during that. So going back to DWI, if you have an open container in the car, it can actually be used as an enhancement or a higher sentence at the time of your sentencing or punishment in the case. So it's just it's an added punishment is essentially the best way to describe it.
So Sean, how many times have you seen someone be successful at actually hiding an open container in their car once they've been pulled over?
It's pretty rare, and mostly because we're talking about a situation. Once somebody gets arrested, they're going to do an inventory search. So even if you hit it really well underneath the floorboard or something like that, they're still going to find it. But I will note, I mean, Gregg may feel different about this than what I do. Yes, a open container certainly does enhance your case, but for me, I think it kind of helps, right? In a lot of circumstances, because at this point, you're just consuming a drink. This drink hasn't hit your system yet. It's your BAC is going to continue to rise, and something that I think we'll address a little bit later. You'll have a rising BAC, and then the state's experts never going to be able to tell you what your BAC was when you're driving, which is what matters.
Yeah, and just to clarify for everybody, because some people are not familiar with the BAC, Sean's talking about your blood alcohol content level, which is basically it's a measurement of how concentrated the alcohol is in your blood, which science allegedly has shows how intoxicated you actually are when you're operating the vehicle. So this next clip we're going to get into, I've actually had no less than I think 5 cases where my client, this is how they were whenever the officer approached, and so I want to hear y'all's opinions on one, have y'all had this experience, and 2, what do you think it helps or harms your case when you're trying to defend it?
Yeah, not for now though. All right, we got a traffic stop, suspicion of DWI. I'm gonna go ahead and need backup. I'm gonna go in and interview the driver. Sir? Sir?
Oh, I forget my mask. My mask.
No, sir, that's not why I'm here. Were you sleeping here on the side of the road?
Well, I was certainly wasn't texting.
Where are you heading tonight?
That way.
Okay, sir, you know what? I'm gonna need you to step out of the vehicle.
Sit right here.
All right, so Sean, how many times have you had a client that's been sleeping when they got pulled over?
I'd probably put it close to 100 at this point.
Whoa, 100?
Sean's represented a lot of people. He's got a lot of experience in this area.
Dang.
It happens way more than I'd like to think. And you know, it's always the same. It's at a light. It's always a big intersection because they have the longest lights. Foot on brake, and the car's still in drive. Every now and then we get lucky and somebody has it in park, but it's pretty rare. And you know, it makes it difficult. It certainly does. And oftentimes, if you are caught in this situation, one of the best things you can do is address to the officer why you were so tired and why you did fall asleep. There is a study that was put out by the National Highway for Traffic and Safety Administration, just NHTSA as we call it, that says that drowsy driving mimics intoxicated driving, and drowsy drivers intimidate. Oh, we'll see. Automatic lights just went out. That these drivers are going to appear to be intoxicated when they're really just drowsy, and so it's hard for an officer to delineate between the two, and that's helpful.
So, Gregg, have you ever come up with a good defense for a sleeping client?
You know, I was thinking about that as this clip was playing, and I can't help but think that I would probably rather have a sleeping client behind the wheel than someone who's weaving in and out of lanes and all over the place, because that gives something that the jury will inevitably be able to see, something tangible that they can say, this person is clearly intoxicated. No one in their right, normal mind would drive this way. And so when you take out one of the things that the officer is supposed to provide on a DWI case, horrible driving, that's the reason they needed to be arrested in the first place. You know, I think as long as the first thing out of their mouth isn't exactly what your brother just did, you know, we generally, it's good to take away the whole aspect of some sort of bad driving and have them start just with field sobriety test or whatever may come after it. So, so it depends. If they do what Parker did, we're not off to a great start. But if they are, like Sean said, be able to articulate why they fell asleep, you know, they had midterms or final exams, or they've worked a double shift, or whatever the situation may be, then that's something that's innocently explained.
So this next clip, I just want to jump straight into this. It's something everybody has a different opinion on. What do you say to the officer when they ask you whether you've been drinking? And I'll let you guys commentate on it. I want to go ahead and get into this clip and get y'all's opinions on this subject.
All right, we got traffic stop, suspicion of DWI. Guy's been swerving all around the road. Call for backup. Excuse me, sir. How we doing tonight?
All right.
Yeah? You know why I stopped you?
I don't know, sir. I seem just trying to get home.
Oh, yeah? Where do you live?
Oh, just right around the corner there a little bit.
Okay. Okay, you been drinking tonight?
You know, a little bit.
Okay, how many beers do you have, or how many drinks do you have tonight?
2?
2, huh?
Yep.
Smells like you had quite a bit more.
Oh, no, that's just, I got bad breath in general.
What's that there in the console?
Spitter? I got an extra dip if you'd like one.
Talking about the other thing.
Oh, that's nothing. Oh, there, officer. Swear to drunk I'm that guy.
All right, I'm gonna have to ask you to step out of the vehicle.
So Greg, we'll start with you. The age-old question is, what do you say to the officer when he or she is asked how much you've had to drink? Do you tell him yes? Do you tell him 2? Because that's what I always hear. What's your advice on that?
Dear God, just do not say 2. Everybody says 2. Just give them some other explanation. I mean, you can say 1, 3. Just don't say 2, because as soon as you say 2, they know that it's that you're drunk, because everybody in the world says 2 for some reason. So I wouldn't say that, but I'm with Sean. I mean, most people think that they need to say, I drank like 5 hours ago and we're good now. If you're under investigation for DWI, if your last drink was 10 minutes before you got in the car, I'm perfectly okay with that.
That's a bold statement for most listeners.
Most people wouldn't understand that. So Sean, please commentate on that, because I know I kind of know where you're heading with it, but I want to hear your opinion about the drinks and then what Greg just said there at the end.
Sure. So for me, I'm of the same opinion. I think don't deny drinking, because then you just look like a liar from the jump, and nobody's really going to believe you. When you say, how much have you had to drink tonight? It's okay to say, like, I've had some. You don't have to comment on a certain number, but if they ask you when, I mean, in reality, I think the best piece of advice you could say is, I had a double Long Island iced tea 5 minutes ago. And kind of the way that works is, and I always try to explain to people, I drew a little really terrible graph that nobody could probably see here.
Love a good graphic
All right,
moment.
demonstratives, perfect.
So, whenever you have a drink, your BAC is going to rise, right? So your BAC is going to rise, and it takes some time. So just like if anybody's ever taken a shot before, you don't feel the effects of that right away. It takes a little bit of time to hit you, and oftentimes when you take multiple shots, it kind of hits you like a brick wall. That's how your BAC works too. So if you're up there and you tell the officer, I just had 4 drinks within the last 30 minutes, you could easily be under a 0.08 when you're driving and much over a 0.08 later, whenever you're getting your blood drawn or blowing into the breathalyzer.
Awesome. Yeah, and obviously we're going to get into the 0.08 thing here in a little bit, because it's a huge myth that I definitely want to talk about. And so, but I do want to move into the field sobriety test for now. So we've got the traffic stop, the first approach, and then now it's those famous tests that everybody thinks that they did fantastic on, and then, a lot of times that's not the case. And, our listeners don't probably need to know all the intricacies of the test, but we basically got, and I'm going to paraphrase what they're called. We've got the pen test. They run the pen in front of your face. And guys, don't get mad that I'm butchering the description of this. I'm just trying to explain for layman's purposes. You got the one-legged stand, and then you've got the walk and turn test. And from what I understand, and Sean, I'd like to hear from you on this, the reason that those tests are used is because the NHTSA group that you talked about earlier, they put out a traffic safety manual that trains all the officers on how to investigate a DWI. Those have been allegedly scientifically proven to show intoxication levels, right?
Right. So there are 3 specific tests. There's the horizontal gaze nystagmus, there's the walk and turn, and the one-leg stand that were quote-unquote validated. What they did is they took individuals of a known dosage, and the officers would check their eyes. For instance, this is the HGN. They check their eyes, they move a pin back and forth, and it's to check to see if your eyes involuntarily twitch. The way and reason your eyes do that is because you've had alcohol introduced to your system. It doesn't actually mean that somebody's intoxicated or not intoxicated, although most police officers would lead you to believe that. But the study that they did showed that, if you're at a 0.10, because that was the legal limit at the time, that something like 70+% of people would have at least 4 out of 6 clues on the HGN. What they conveniently left off is that they had a ridiculous amount of people that were below a 0.04 that were also showing 4 out of 6 clues on HGN. And unfortunately, whenever these field sobriety tests are taught, it's officers who teach officers who teach officers who teach officers. It's nobody who's ever actually done the studies, much less read the studies. All they do is look at the little highlights and go, yep, that means you're drunk. So.
Sounds like a game of telephone.
So I'd like to go ahead and jump into our next clip because there's some discussion on whether you should participate in the test or not. So I'd like to look at this and then hear from Gregg about what you think about refusing the test versus participating in them.
All right, so the reason I got you out the car, I smell alcohol in there. You told me you've been drinking, so got you out here now. We just got a couple of tests I'm going to have you perform. If you do well enough on the test, then I'm going to send you on your way, okay?
You gonna let me go if I do these tests right?
Well, if the test, if you do well enough on the test, then yeah. I just got to make sure you hadn't been drinking, make sure that you're safe to be on the roads with everybody.
Now, I need to do these tests. Is it required?
Well, you have. I mean, if you don't do them, I'm going to probably take you to jail. So you either need to do them or not do them, but you kind of have to do them.
Hey, wait, hold on. I know my rats. I don't think I need to do that. I know my rats. Sir.
So, Gregg, tell us what you think about whether to refuse or participate in the test.
My gut reaction is to always have clients refuse a test. I mean, it's just, I have never come across a jury where they held someone's field sobriety test against them, unless the field sobriety tests were just so horrific that anyone who was sober would never have done that bad. But it's a case that, as always, as defense attorneys, we want the prosecutors to prove everything. And so the more evidence that you give them by doing these monkey tests, the easier you're making it on them. And you get an officer a chance to talk about why you were intoxicated, why you failed the test. And so if you can just say, look, if you think I'm intoxicated and you want to take me into jail, then put your hands behind your back and just go in. But the less evidence that you can arm them with, the better.
So, Sean, I know that you've told me before that you hear this all the time. You have a lot of clients come in your office and say, no, it's fine. I did great on the test. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so kind of what happens here is everybody goes, I walked down that line just fine. I held my foot up for 25 seconds. I followed that little pin with my eyes. Unfortunately, that's just not how it works. The walk and turn test, for example, is broken up into 2 little phases, and it's really about exact, minute details on how you're supposed to do everything. It's really easy to mess up, and you really do give the officer some ammunition. Walk or one leg stand still the same. It's not can you keep your foot up for 30 seconds. It's can you do that while not swaying, while not hopping, while not putting your hands down or hands up. Kind of to go as to the advice here. I mean, to me, it works 2 ways. Either if you're going to decline, just say, officer, these tests are voluntary, correct? And the officer will say, yeah. You go then at this point, I'd like to decline them, respectfully or something. If you say something like that, a jury will love that. If you are going to perform then any injury you've ever had in your life, you should just go ahead and just say it right then and there. Make sure it's on the video so you're not just bringing it up in the middle of trial. You should be like, I hurt my knee when I was snowboarding in Colorado about a couple years ago. It's never been the same then. I'm not a man of great balance, so don't hold this against me. Because the reality is if you're doing field sobriety tests, there's a pretty dang good chance that you're already going to jail. And in reality is the officer is going to score you one way, but a jury scores you another way, right? The jury goes, I don't care about these numbers, clues, all that stuff. Did the guy look drunk or not? So I think you have to take a honest look at how much you had to drink and kind of make that decision there. And I know that's very lawyerly to just say it depends, but that's kind of how it works.
So, as a lady who does wear heels, well, maybe not so much now, thanks coronavirus, if I get pulled over and I have high heels on, do I take the heels off before performing these tests, or do I keep my heels on?
So I think that's going to really depend on you. My wife included, used to wear heels all the time and would probably perform better with them than without. The officer is supposed to give you the opportunity to remove them. And I think the manual says if the heels are above 2.5 inches, they're supposed to be removed. The best thing that could happen is if you had a pair of flats in the trunk or something, or a pair of sneakers or something, just say, hey officer, I've got some flats in the back. You think I could grab those? And if the officer says no, then he looks like a total D-bag, and the jury's really going to see that. And hopefully that'll help out with your performance. But really, it's a matter of personal preference.
Good to know.
So I've got one last clip that I want us to look at, because I've had cases, I'm sure both of y'all have as well, where we've got the 3 main tests that are talked about in the NHTSA manual, but officers have somebody do something like count backwards in the ABCs or count down from a number, tests that aren't necessarily discussed, at least not in detail in the NHTSA manual. So I want to show this last clip and get y'all's opinion on those types of tests.
All right, so the reason I got you out here, like I said, is it smells some alcohol. You said you've been drinking, so got a couple of these tests. So the first one we're going to do...
I know this test. I got ZYX, VUT, SRQP, and MLOJKHIFEDCBA.
Boys, bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you, bad boy?
I think he thought he was free to go after passing that one. But so Greg, have you seen tests that are not the 3 that we've talked about that cops have administered to use in these field sobriety tests?
Yeah, there's a couple that they'll throw in there. One's called the Romberg test, where you essentially lean your head back, estimate 30 seconds, and if you're within 5 seconds on both sides, then apparently you're normal. But their favorite one is to put you on the spot and have you start the alphabet in some random spot like D and go to T, or go from 38 down to 22. And the only reason they're doing that is just more tests, more things that they can put in front of the jury or the prosecutors to prove that you didn't have your mental wherewithal. But it kind of goes to the advice of why you shouldn't really do tests in the first place, because the more things that you allow an officer to ask you and do, it's just arming them with more information. And I can't think of anyone. I've got a 2.5-year-old, and she sings the whole alphabet song from A to Z, never stops. And all of us were trained that way. And so when an officer asks you to start at D and go to T, it kind of throws everybody off, whether you're drinking or not.
Sean, have you had to deal with these, I don't want to call them unorthodox, but these tests that aren't necessarily the main ones in some of your court cases?
Oh yeah, we get all those ones that he's mentioned there. Some officers want to train eventually to be drug recognition experts, and they have their own set of field sobriety tests, and those ones are fun, where you spin a circle around somebody's face and then nearly touch their nose to see if their eyes cross. There's all sorts of fun things. But I love whenever officers do that Romberg test, the one where you keep your eyes closed and hold for 30 seconds, because that allows me to ask them in trial, hey, that test was developed to test for syphilis, right? And then the officer goes, what? And I go, it's right here, and I show them the study. And they go, does my client have syphilis? And usually at that point, they're so uncomfortable, and the jury breaks into laughter. And when you get the jury laugh, you're always...
Nice. Nice. Well, so we went through all three phases of the stop. We talked about some of the things you guys need to think about when you're going through that. But I know when we were preparing for the show, we talked about myths of DWIs because you hear them all the time because everyone's got an opinion, or their brothers, friends, girlfriends, mom's a lawyer, and they heard that this is what you're supposed to do. So Sean, I want to stick with you because you've done so much work in the scientific arena when it comes to DWI stops. One of the big myths that I know you hear all the time that you brought up is that if I'm over a .08, there's no real reason for me to fight the charge. So I'd like for you to talk to our audience about that a little bit.
Sure. So I think it's there's a couple points to it. So earlier we talked about the concept of a rising BAC. So whenever somebody has a drink and later it hits them, and then when they do their blood work or their blow, it's above a .08. In Texas, what matters is what you are at the time of driving. That's not the same for every state. I'd say about half the states in the U.S. follow this rule, and the other half follow the test is whatever the test is. There's something there. And then also, I think you have to depend on this police science in order to actually get yourself there. So a jury has to believe that that number is actually accurate, right? So to give 2 or 3 examples here, a breath test has a .02 plus or minus sort of variance there, where if you blow a .08, your second number could be anywhere between a .06 and a .10. And that sort of variance right there would have been totally scientifically acceptable. It leads juries not to believe kind of that concept. Also, when it comes to blood work, there's like a million different things that you can have with air. So whenever they draw your blood, they draw it in these little gray top tubes, right? And in the bottom, they have sodium fluoride, potassium oxalate. It's to keep your blood from clotting and fermenting and all that stuff. Well, sometimes we have cases like this happened recently all over Texas, where a bunch of vials were recalled, right? So this is one of them. I actually on Amazon bought and just happened to get the right lot where it contained no powder in it whatsoever. And so what happened there is I probably had 40, 50 cases in Harris County that were affected by this, and all of them got tossed because the blood got tossed because they couldn't find it to be reliable and accurate. And kind of to compound on that, let's say it is right, they still have to do everything right. They don't test that tube that they just showed you. They actually test it in something right here called a headspace vial. And really all they do is put one little tiny drop in there, and they have to make sure they do it accurately, because if they put in too much blood or too little blood, or they also put something in there called an internal standard, if they put too much or too little of that, it can vastly change the effects of your results. And having somebody who's skilled in DWI defense, knows how to look at blood work, we can actually see where these errors happen because everything's documented by computer. And so if we notice these inaccuracies, that's when we tell them to put 6 or 12 in the box and we set it for a jury trial.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that's key that for our listeners to understand is that you need somebody trained in DWI defense like the two men we have here, because everything you just talked about, some of that, I understand a lot of that, but that's because I've at least practiced in the area for a while. But the science part of it, I mean, that goes over my head quite a bit. And that's why you've got, someone like Sean who's trained and can be able to talk to 12 people, like you said, 12 jurors or 6 jurors about this situation. Gregg, one of the myths I want to hear from you about is if my BAC, my blood alcohol content, is less than 0.08, they can't convict me, and I should be getting off scot-free.
Well, they're definitely going to have a tough road ahead to prove, because for the same reasons that people believe that they're automatically convicted for having a BAC over 0.08, people believe that they're automatically should be dismissed if they have a BAC below 0.08. But it's all about what your BAC was at the time of driving. This is where it's so damaging that if you said my last drink was 5 hours ago, then you've been in what's called an elimination state for probably 3.5 to 4 hours by that point. And so the prosecutor can say, yeah, the blood test was 2 hours after the stop. He'd been eliminating alcohol for those 2 hours, and so he was actually, or she was actually closer to a 0.1 or a 0.11 or a 0.12. So just because your BAC is below 0.08 does not mean that they're going to dismiss the case. Now, it's easier to convince them to do that because juries don't like seeing that. They think it's a waste of their time to try those cases, but they still very well can prosecute you for it.
And that makes a lot of sense. And obviously everything else that we talked about with this traffic stop, field sobriety test, all of that, obviously factors into it. So one of the big myths I want to diffuse here and hear from both of you guys on, Sean, I'll start with you. The no refusal weekend thing, it's been a big movement in Texas. I don't remember how many years ago it started, but I know now in some counties, and you can maybe tell me this, I've heard even like in Harris County, it seems like every single weekend is a no refusal weekend. Can you explain or diffuse the myth that if it's a no refusal weekend, I have no choice, I have to give a sample?
Right. So the way it works is this: on a no refusal weekend that's set out by the state of Texas, if you refuse, then they're going to get a search warrant, right? That basically means, hey, we have judges on call. In Harris County, it is no refusal every day. We have judges at all hours. So you can totally consent or refuse, but they're going to get a sample. Now, the smaller counties that you move out to, so for us, let's say we're going to like Waller County, I guess. They're not always going to have a judge ready to sign a warrant. And they really, even though they can, don't want to bother Harris County District Court judges because technically they could get them to sign the warrant. And so what they do is they just say, all right, cool, now we have a DWI with no blood or no breath, and they just go forward with that. Now, if it's a no refusal weekend, then they have judges who are working and they're going to get that search warrant signed and they're going to get your blood. But kind of how it works with admitting things, it's kind of the same way here. Is, in my opinion, consenting to a blood draw is probably the worst thing you could do. I think if you're going to consent to a breath test, okay, cool. I still have a lot to work with there because breath tests are terrible. But when you consent to a blood test, you're killing my ability to see if the warrant was done properly. And that's where a lot of cases get thrown out because the officers and the DAs kind of get sloppy with everything. And so by refusing, you're making them do something extra. Kind of what I always advise clients to do, and I tell them when I'm representing them, is whenever they read you that form and they say like, hey, here are the penalties for refusing, which are potential license suspension, which you can, obviously request a hearing on and win. I always tell clients to respond back to the officer. So if I give you this breath or if I give you this blood, I'm still going to jail. I'm still under arrest, correct? And the officer is going to say, yes, correct. And at that point you go, okay, then I guess I'm not going to consent. I'm going to refuse. When a jury hears that, it triggers in their mind too. And they're like, oh, wait, you mean even if this guy blew and he blew a 0.04 or a 0.06, he was not going to be going home? And I make sure to ask all my officers that, hey, if my guy blew under, would you have let him go? Because if he says yes, then he's just given up that he didn't have enough for a field sobriety test. Kind of have to have fun with it.
Yeah, no, I understand that. So Gregg, just to break this down for our listeners, if you refuse to give a sample, the only way they can get your blood at that point, they have to go get the search warrant like Sean was talking about. They've got to get a warrant that's signed by a judge. That's why it's important that the judges are, on call during these no refusal weekends. And so what's your advice for people pulled over on suspicion of a DWI during a no refusal weekend?
Refuse. I mean, just like Sean was saying, just because it says no refusal weekend, the police, because it's illegal under the Fourth Amendment, can't force you to do anything, to give up any sort of what they would deem a search of your person or your property or anything. And that's what your blood is. I mean, they're taking it from your body. And before they're allowed to do so, they need a judge to say that you can lawfully take a blood specimen from this person. So just because it's no refusal weekend, refuse, and refuse.
Perfect. Well, guys, just to wrap up, I'd like to give it back to both you guys, and I'd like to start with you, Sean. I just want to hear, we always like to give our listeners a takeaway so that they can walk away with some very concrete knowledge, and you guys have laid out a lot of great things today. But if you had to give 3 pieces of advice, top 3 tips, Sean, to our listeners when being pulled over under suspicion of DWI, what would those be?
Sure. So I think the first one is the obvious one here. You need to be polite and respectful the entire time. Not because it's going to make the officer like you or anything like that. You're not concerned about that. You're concerned about your jury later on. The client who makes it easy for a jury to want to convict them will often get convicted. Number two is going to be when the officer asks you when your last drink was, tell them you just had it. Don't lie, right? Because in almost every circumstance, you were just leaving a bar. It makes the jury get some credibility out of you to begin with, plus it gives me something to work with. And then three, if they're asking for a specimen of your blood, refuse. Absolutely. Make them get that search warrant, make them do that work. There's nothing wrong about it. You absolutely have that right. And unlike other states, it's not illegal to refuse, period. All we have to deal with is a license hearing. And then, at least in Harris County, our cops never show up to them. So there's not a huge penalty there. That's it.
So, Greg, I gave you the harder job because I let Sean go first. So, what are your 3 tips? And I understand there may be a little overlap, but what are your 3 tips you want our listeners to walk away with?
Well, to kind of piggyback on the first one, because that was my first one, he stole it from me. Just remember that in today's day and world, the police officers are wearing body cams. All of them are. And so from the moment that they talk to you at the car window, they're recording you. So pretend as if the jury is watching it, because they will be, from the very, very moment that you get pulled over. And something that's different in DWI cases than any other cases is the people who are on your jury most likely either have been arrested for DWI before, know somebody who's been arrested for DWI, or very well has been in a situation where they shouldn't have been driving and they know it. And so because of that, they are much more sympathetic to these cases than they are in any other case, like an ag assault with a deadly weapon or some sort of theft case where most people don't find themselves. So just remember that the jury's watching from the jump. Refuse the field sobriety test, especially if you know that you're not going to look all that great at all. And then stealing from the third one as well. Just make sure you refuse, because that search warrant is huge. Make them take that extra step. They wanted to arrest you under DWI. Make them prove it.
Well, guys, thank you all so much for being here. I know that you guys have obviously shown why. Andrea and I know that you guys are 2 of the best in the business when it comes to DWI defense, showing all the background information and really giving our listeners some concrete, easy tips to follow. And so we're airing this right before 4th of July weekend, just in time to give people the information they need for going out. So we want everybody, and I'm going to echo what I know all 4 of us would say, is don't drink and drive.
Yeah, really don't.
Don't drink and drive. Be safe. But it's important to know your rights if you're pulled over under suspicion of DWI. So, guys, thanks again. Listeners, thank you for being here with us here on #Lawyered, and we'll see you again next time.